Hello and welcome to SharePoint in the Cloud, evaluating impact, pros and cons. Today's presentation will be all about really what SharePoint is, whether it makes sense to do it in the cloud, in hosted scenarios, or on-prem, and some of the differences between those. My name is Richard Harbridge, and I work for Portal Solutions, and Portal Solutions is also the sponsor of this material. So with that, why don't we begin? My name is Richard Harbridge, as I mentioned. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can follow me and find me on my blog at rharbridge.com. And of course, all that information will be available at the end of this presentation, so feel free to skip to that if you're just trying to get contact info. I do work for a company named Portal Solutions. I'm a SharePoint senior architect and evangelist. And it's actually a pretty interesting company. We do a lot of work in the US and we do some work in Canada. So we work in the blue area indicated on the map here. And we have offices in Boston and DC. The interesting thing about Portal Solutions is it's a SharePoint focused company. That's what we do. So unlike a lot of other companies, we're at 50 plus people and we only really do SharePoint services. So we do intranets, extranets, portals, all the typical workloads you'd expect from SharePoint. And what that means is you have all these specialized people, right? People that have a lot of deep expertise and experience in one technology. And it makes it quite interesting because SharePoint is such a big tool set and it's such a complex product and platform. Being able to bounce ideas off of other people in the company, being able to have a meeting with quite a few architects that have a lot of experience, hundreds of implementations under our belts, if we can all sit together and start to walk through some of these challenges, you get an answer very quickly. So that's quite interesting on its own merits. And then, of course, for today's presentation, what we're going to be talking about is, SharePoint in the cloud and evaluating sort of, is the cloud the right solution or is on-premise the right solution? And so in our organization, it's a very prominent discussion, especially right now. And it's good to know that you have a lot of different people who have different experiences, either through the clients that we work with, which is quite a few in Office 365 implementations or hosted scenarios, or obviously a tremendous number of on-premise implementations at this point in time. So it's quite interesting, just understand that we do love it. And more importantly, if you haven't gotten involved in your local community and you have these types of questions, you need to find people you can use as trusted advisors. So, be sure to attend user groups, SharePoint Saturdays, which are free conferences. Look up online thought leadership and resources. And again, contact myself or Portal Solutions if you ever have a question, and we'll be sure to answer that. Recently, I finished a book called Microsoft SharePoint for Business Executives with quite a few other talented authors. And in one section of the book, we do talk about SharePoint in the cloud. So feel free to grab that book if you're interested. And then if you're not, just feel free to tell me what could have been better about the book, and what we can do is we can include that in future ones. For the sake of conversation and discussions today, if you do have any questions that are a bit more technical, for most of the presentation today, we're going to stick at a pretty high level. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds because there's so much to cover. But if you do have technical questions beyond that, again, feel free to reach out to myself or anyone at Portal Solutions, because as I said, we have a lot of very talented, very experienced people. So our goal today is really to get from sort of this, I'm not sure what SharePoint in the cloud is, and is it a good idea to really consider Office 365 right now, versus my on-prem implementation? I'm on 2007, I'm on 2010, what are the differences? It's to talk about some of those considerations and then to kind of help make it clearer what SharePoint in the cloud really is today. And so that's our goal, right? To create confidence, clarity, and a little bit of direction around whether or not SharePoint in the cloud might be right for you. And just a quick warning, I do talk fast, so for the rest of the presentation I will be talking at this speed. Now the good thing is, since this is recorded, you can go back, but you will get a lot of information. So again, be ready for it, and if not, just remember you have that pause button and you may need to use it. Alright, and with that, why don't we begin? So why is SharePoint in the cloud will be the first thing we talk through. Then we're going to talk about what is SharePoint in the cloud. And most of that conversation is going to be focused on Office 365 because I think that's where most of the challenges and sort of miscommunication may exist. Then we're going to talk about some concerns in the cloud. And then, based on time, we'll probably skip through it, but there will be some discussion around evaluating cloud providers and how to do that, and quite a few resources. And again, since this is recorded, it should be pretty easy for you to pause it and kind of skip through those slides at your own pace. And so with that, let's start out with the discussions around why is SharePoint in the cloud? So I think that one of the first key concepts that needs to be understood is that there's a difference between sort of infrastructure as a service offerings and software as a service offerings. And the key here is that typically the more we structure an offering, the more we standardize it, the more we kind of create, you'll hear this term multi-tenant or shared. So when we start to share or have multiple tenants on one piece of hardware or one implementation, you tend to have to standardize more. You have to set more constraints. And what that means is it's quite easy to ramp up, right? It's less complexity, there's less risks, right, with customizations and other things. But on the downside, that also means that you don't have that same level of control. So for SharePoint, this is a good example, because when we think of these sort of levels, if you will, of cloud technology and cloud offerings, there are infrastructure as a service offerings for SharePoint. There's quite a few hosting providers that will build you SharePoint servers, and they'll manage the server topology and the server farm and the server specifications. But what they'll do is they'll rely on you for everything, maybe at central administration and below, or perhaps even higher than that, everything that deals with the services of SharePoint and so on and so forth. Now the advantage of that type of scenario is that you have someone who's hosting it, so you get some scale and other things that we'll talk about in a bit, but you also have the control where you can actually deploy, farm level solutions, these advanced customizations when you're in that sort of infrastructure as a service level. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is when we start to get into something like software as a service, like Office 365, you don't get that same type of capability. And if you think of even offerings from Microsoft, like Azure has great potential from a platform as a service perspective, because we can build applications and solutions. And what we can do is we can scale that, but actually point to it either on-prem or in another environment, and kind of make a relationship, if you will, between our subscribed or structured SharePoint implementation and the applications that may be running in, say, a platform as a service offering from Azure or another provider. Like we can also do things like that on Amazon and other things. And the infrastructure service, again, Azure is doing, they're still in beta, but they're going through this sort of testing process where they've proven that you can easily host SharePoint servers in Azure. So that's quite interesting on its own merits. And then, of course, we have, our own company. We host quite a few environments on Amazon right now from an infrastructure as a service level perspective. So with that, let's move on to the next point. Again, you really need to understand this key concept. Without that, you probably won't understand a lot of the other stuff we'll talk about from a cloud perspective. And if those terms were new to you, again, just look them up online and try and get a bit better grasp of cloud technology. So one of the big benefits of SharePoint specifically in the cloud is that it allows for minimal entry cost. So one of the challenges with, if you think about SharePoint now on-prem, we have quite a large implementation cost and implementation footprint, right? We have very large servers, right? The newest version of SharePoint takes, on average 16 gigs of RAM, right? We're talking about multiple cores. And these are beefy machines, and not only are these beefy machines, but typically you need at least two servers at a very minimum, right? A SQL server and a web front end. But in most farms, you're going to have an index server, you're going to have a couple web front ends. So you can see where the hardware on its own merits would start to cost a lot. But then you start to look at licensing, and if we look at the implications of purchasing that licensing up front, that's quite a big investment, especially if your company's either not sure you're really going to leverage SharePoint, or you're not certain that you're going to leverage it to the extent that you're really willing to make that sizable investment up front. And that doesn't take into account the services cost to implement, SharePoint, install SharePoint, and do all that. So it is nice to have these either software as a service offerings or even the infrastructure as a service offerings that really help minimize some of the entry costs for SharePoint, whether it's a host provider or Microsoft's 365 offering. The second big one is that using cloud-based technologies and using SharePoint in the cloud means that typically you're paying per use. And most cloud technologies, this is sort of the new option that's provided. And the reason for this is since they're providing this option at scale, they're able to manage and monitor how much utilization on, say, CPU resources you use. So if I take something like building an app in Azure, then we can actually see and get charged based on how much of the resources that I've sort of spun up I'm utilizing. And that could work for Amazon as well. So if that's one new option that's provided by these cloud providers, the reason it's exciting and enticing is a lot of organizations may have implemented SharePoint internally for quite some time, but it's really challenging to see just how often is it used. How much are we really leveraging it, and how do we do chargebacks and billbacks internally right now? If we are able to use something like Office 365 or one of these hosted providers, at least being able to get those bills and getting charged in that way allows us to potentially, depending on the number of farms and the number of environments, it allows us to bill it back a little bit easier to the business than maybe in our previous scenarios. So that on its own merits is quite an interesting scenario where you can actually get some value just from the way that SharePoint's being measured from these hosting providers, the way that they're measuring, bandwidth costs and storage costs and other things that you may not be able to do as effectively internally right now. The other big one, obviously, is that implementation. So we talked about that minimal entry cost. It's also important to understand the idea of CapEx to OpEx. So I'm not going to talk about finances too deeply with you guys, but make sure you understand, that this is a big change and that you're able to pay over time versus that initial investment. And that also means that you can see more consistent pricing. It does mean that if over a long enough period of time you're going to pay more, so that's worth noting. But it does mean at least consistency. So you're not going to be surprised nearly as frequently with an OpEx model versus a CapEx one. And the last one, just to understand, is, this makes sense. SharePoint needs to be offered in the cloud because if we look at the way that large providers are changing scale of discounts when they buy and provision all this hardware, for managing, monitoring hardware. You just can't compete with that internally. And so every organization that I've talked to in the past 2 years, they've been looking at cloud, they've been looking at, if not cloud, large data center scenarios and other things like that, and how to take advantage of these things. So again, just recognize that this is a good thing and that it means that typically you can get a discount. For Microsoft, this is also quite interesting because it means that they can actually offer a licensing discount for things like Office 365 versus on-premise. And so that is something that Microsoft does do in a slightly interesting way, but it's important to note that they have that power as well since they're the provider, right? They provide licensing, so why not discount it if you're going to be using their services or specifically their software as a service offering? So what we're really saying is that the cloud enables, the basics, right? On-demand computing, rapidly provisioning, minimal management, but that has sort of drawbacks, right? And you need to understand that it's not necessarily for everything. And we're going to talk about some specific scenarios where SharePoint doesn't work great for the cloud. And it's also important to understand that there are some other solutions just generically. If we're saying, what about other technologies in our organization, ERP systems and other things, it may not be really ready, right? The cloud may not be mature. The offerings may not be mature. The products that run on these may not be mature and ready for it as well. So, and certainly standards aren't necessarily mature. So please just watch out for, is our workload, is what we're doing with SharePoint the right option for moving to the cloud? All right, so now we understand why SharePoint's in the cloud, but what is it in the cloud? What is SharePoint in the cloud today? Well, first thing we need to understand is this idea of SharePoint cloud models. And there's basically 3 models of SharePoint in the cloud. There's sort of the all-in, where we take everything on-premise and we move it into SharePoint Online, or we move it into these cloud-based providers. And so if you think of these, obviously I have SharePoint 2010 in here, but this could work just the same for 2013. What we're really talking about is many scenarios in organizations where they're creating a public-facing website for SharePoint, they'll actually use this model now. And the reason for that is they don't really need, strong AD integration. They don't need that users being able to log in with the same credentials they necessarily use on-prem or in their internal enterprise environments, because there's such a small subset of users that are sort of managing or administrating the content on the public-facing website. So sometimes organizations will look to a hosting provider for, bandwidth reasons, for reliability reasons, and for lots and lots of other reasons for a public-facing website, and they'll build, the environment, or they'll have them host it And then what they'll do is they'll, have SharePoint running in that environment, and that'll be kind of isolated from their other SharePoint implementations internally. So that's one consideration for, going with, in this case, maybe a dedicated model. Dedicated would be where I go to somebody else who's basically offering infrastructure as a service, or they're offering SharePoint in a dedicated instance to me. So I'd still be able to deploy customizations. I'd still be able to do things like that. But, it's basically somebody else is managing that, and that's the dedicated scenario. The other options for all-in are shared scenarios. So if you look at current environments right now, I could take SharePoint Exchange, Link, and other services, and I could say, you know what, I don't want to run those on-premise anymore for lots of financial reasons, for lots of scaling reasons and growth reasons. And so what I'll do is I'm going to go to Microsoft, and I'm going to say, I will subscribe to Office 365, which is a shared, right? It's a multi-tenant or shared implementation environment. And I'm going to say, can you, take these workloads? And of course they can, right? They can take over SharePoint, Exchange, and Link, and that means that I don't need those on-prem. So that would be like a migration scenario. Alternatively, I may just start up in that all-in scenario. Many organizations right now that are new organizations that are starting are using cloud models first rather than building any expertise and infrastructure internally for a lot of those other systems. So that's worth noting as well. Some other interesting scenarios for all-in, demo, devs, test, right? So we, as an example in our organization, all our demo environments, for the most part, are not on-premise, right? We don't use that. We use other services for that. And the reason for that is, when you think about it, we don't need demo environments up running, very often. We actually turn on and off demo environments on Amazon, or we use Office 365 instances just to save costs because we really don't need it to be running at all times. And then same thing can go with test, right? If we have a client who has very specific needs, they have multiple servers and a specific configuration, we may recreate that configuration in, say, Amazon, but never turn on those servers unless we need to do testing that really requires that sort of similar to client implementation scenario. And of course, as you can imagine, we develop a lot of scripts to do these things. The second scenario is the trusted hybrid, and this is obviously the most preferred scenario, right? So what we're doing here is we're saying that really the big thing that's different between all-in or isolated and the trusted hybrid is that there's some sort of identity federation. There's some sort of identity synchronization between the environments, so that when I sign in with my enterprise account on-prem and I go to this other hosted environment, the sign-in experience is either very similar or there is no sign-in experience and it auto-signs me in. So that's really an important concept, right? So we really want to have that trust between those environments, and that enables more scenarios, right? We can actually have some collaboration where you're going from one environment to another. You can have document management, extranets is a very common one where you can have that trust relationship. You can have my sites potentially, or personally, you can use the social features, if you will, in Office 365 and have those hosted externally. You can imagine scenarios where you might have, again, some of your own QA servers, but still on the same, network the same Active Directory, just for testing purposes and other reasons. So there's lots of reasons that trusted hybrid is a good model. And we'll talk more about trusted hybrid today than probably any of the other models. The last one is untrusted hybrid. And in general, my general feeling on this one is to try and avoid it. But if you are going to do it, if this is the option that you're looking at for cost savings or other reasons, just understand that they're really not connected, right? You have typically an on-premise SharePoint implementation, and you have very, very specific isolated workloads that are going on and being worked on from this untrusted hybrid. And that's important to understand. So if I was to take an Office 365 and I had SharePoint running on-prem, perhaps I do business intelligence and other capabilities on-prem as like a very specialized portal or a specialized niche of functionality, but then the rest of my organization is in Office 365. The problem with that, if we don't think this through, is that people will log into Office 365 using credentials, in this case, since there's no federation, using Office 365 credentials, but then when they log into the on-premise environment for business intelligence or something, they would need to use distinct credentials. And so that can be a really, really painful thing for users, and I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, I'm not saying that trust is only through Active Directory federation or only through user identity. There is some other trust scenarios, and we'll talk about those, but just understand that in general, to be quite honest, untrusted, if there's not at least some hybrid scenario in there, is probably not the right move, just because of the implication of pure usability and the impact it's going to have on users. I mean, the good thing is they're completely isolated environments. So a really good example of using an untrusted would be an extranet. I want to spin up a hosted or cloud-based environment for an extranet so that users can log in and share documents and do this and that, but they're going to use unique credentials because you know what? It's for external purposes. It's really not part of our core enterprise offerings internally. And that could be really important for things like mergers and acquisitions, deal rooms. You can imagine quite a few scenarios where that level of trust is not something you actually want for quite a few reasons, from user management and security. So the next thing I'll kind of talk about is that difference between dedicated and shared. You know, I mentioned a couple scenarios for dedicated and shared, but I just want to clarify. So if I have SharePoint dedicated, what that really means is that I have control of farm, servers, services, typically the web applications and the databases. So that the thing that's hidden there is web applications. So if we have control of all those things, that gives us a lot of flexibility. It allows us to deploy quite a few customizations. It also allows us to change quite a few settings. As you can imagine, there are a lot of services settings and there are a lot of web application specific settings or even database settings that we can manage that have quite a few impacts in our SharePoint environment. And you think of Office 365, say, in their shared or multi-tenant scenarios, those offerings, those subscription-based offerings, they're typically designed so that you have access to everything at the site collection level and below. There are exceptions to this. You know, you may have access to, say, the taxonomy store for managed metadata or some other scenarios, very specialized, but it's pretty rare, right? The majority of your focus and your effort is going to be on everything below the site collection level. And that's important because, again, when you're thinking of customizations, if you are a SharePoint architect or if you have some expertise with this, you'll kind of understand the significant gap between having access to everything sort of above site collections and then in your shared scenario, only having access to everything below it. And by the way, that could be a positive, right? It can, again, mean that there's less complexity and there's less risk. So I did want to call out, I'm just going to have this slide up again. You can pause the deck if you want to take a look at it, just to make sure everyone understands that extranets are the most prominent use case still to this day for SharePoint in the cloud. So if you are doing an extranet, you should really consider, do you really want to put that in your own environment? And some of the big reasons are managing identities and other things like that that you would have to take ownership for if you do it yourself in your own environment. So just keep that in mind. I'm just going to highlight again that we do use Amazon internally. We provision quite a few instances. Two things to know about Amazon. One, there's this idea of spot pricing and sort of different pricing scenarios that you can do, and so we do quite a bit to try and save money where appropriate. So there's actually times where we may do certain types of development where we can actually reduce our costs. And the second thing, so it's just enabled new options for us from a company perspective. The second thing that's important here is to understand that when we do implement SharePoint in Amazon or some of these, I'm going to say less SharePoint friendly server environments or these cloud-based providers for infrastructure, what we have to do is we have to have effective scripts to install it, to configure it, to do other things, because obviously doing this on a one-off basis is going to be really, really difficult. And as you can even imagine, spinning up a SharePoint instance includes a lot of warm-up, so there's a lot of other things you can do to accelerate that. So really keep in mind, if you are going to use some of these other services like Amazon, potentially Azure, right, as it goes out of beta for infrastructure, just understand and rationalize that you'll have to do quite a bit of scripting and thought on how you're going to do your provisioning. And again, please keep an eye on Azure and basically when that infrastructure as a service for SharePoint implementations become really a viable and public option for Azure. So the next thing we're going to really dive into is what is Office 365, specifically that standard or shared hosting. So this is not the dedicated offering of Office 365. The majority of our conversation is going to be on the shared. So the first thing I'm going to note, just before we completely remove dedicated from the equation when we talk about Office 365, is to understand that dedicated is not for everyone. So Microsoft does offer, as of right now, a dedicated SharePoint Office 365 opportunity. And basically the way it works is if you have less than 5,000 people, then it's really not for you. And the reason for that is economies of scale and the costs and just the way that this thing works from a pricing model perspective, it's really not designed and appropriate for most organizations under 5,000. I'm not saying it is for sure. There are opportunities and there are times where it might be, but in general, it's typically too expensive or cost prohibitive for less than 5,000 people. Now, if you do have over 5,000 people and you're really looking, for that idea of, hey, who would be a great managing my infrastructure, managing my Office 365 environment, or managing my SharePoint environment? Microsoft. So I'm going to go with dedicated offering for Microsoft, for Office 365, which still enables me to deploy solutions, still enables me to build farm level solutions and other things that require full trust, but, go through a process with Microsoft to deploy those and have them sort of orchestrating that. So again, if you do want that type of dedicated, then maybe Office 365 dedicated is for you. But for the majority of people, it probably isn't. The second thing to consider here is that if you still want dedicated SharePoint offerings, recognize that you don't need Microsoft to host that for you. There's lots of people who do server-provided license agreements, which basically allow them to price by core or CPU core and things like that versus the way that we price by users. And so it allows for very competitive, lower cost hosting scenarios. So some examples are Rackspace, FP Web, and quite a few other amazing providers out there that you can take a look at for dedicated hosting. So again, make sure you understand that you're not alone in this. The next thing I just want to quickly cover is if you haven't heard of Office 365 and you're watching this, the gist is it's Office Professional, so you can install and use the Office licensing from online. You get Exchange, you get SharePoint, and you get Link. There is some new functionality in what's coming in the end of February, which is February 2013, which will be things like Project, and you're going to get some better implementation, if you will, in integration between CRM and so on and so forth. But right now, it's basically everything you would typically do with Microsoft products on-prem, you would do with Office 365. Obviously, your SQL option would be SQL Azure versus SQL on-prem for your basic consideration there. So what does moving to Office 365 mean? Well, as you can imagine, it's a single architecture, so that means quite a bit of standardization. Your deployment is actually going to require migrating. So one of the things that's almost always missed when people start talking about Office 365 is they forget that there's a huge cost potentially in migrating your data to Office 365. And you really need to understand not only what the costs are getting your content into Office 365, but also what the cost might be getting it back out of Office 365 if that isn't the right solution for you in the long term or even in the short term. Another big one is Active Directory cleanup and network upgrade is often required. So if you really haven't, if you're going to do those trust scenarios that we're talking about, you need ADFS, right? Active Directory Federation services. You need a bunch of things, and you need your Active Directory to be pretty clean for that to be effective. So keep that in mind. Another big one is that, and this is really clear right now, a lot of the clients and other people that we work with and that we've seen, when they have hybrid, right, when you have that sort of, we know we want to move to Office 365, but we're going to do it over 2 years or whatever amount of time, that is a bit painful because it's a prolonged period of discomfort, right? It's not perfect. There are little challenges because people are, we do have federation of identities, but then you run into the idea that each this address is this location, this address is this one. They have different permission and ownership and other things like that. So just keep in mind that there's quite a bit of planning. So hybrid can be a bit of a challenge and requires just extensive effort and planning up front to make sure you're aware of some of those challenges. And then I won't talk about the other ones because they're pretty obvious. The next thing we want to talk about briefly is sort of the before SharePoint 2013 changes. So again, end of February. Before those changes go into effect, so if you are watching that now, because it's just before that in February right now, this is sort of the functionality that's available. And by the way, if you are a current user of Office 365 or somebody who's considered it in the past, you may have even seen some of this before, that the parity isn't quite there, right? In the 2010 variation of it, if you will, what we have is we don't have web analytics, right, which is a big one, so no usage statistics. We don't have fast or a lot of the fast type search capability. We don't have word automation services. We don't have Record Center, which is a big one. So that's the Record Center site template. You can do in-place records and stuff. It's just not quite as strong. And then, of course, none of the BI capabilities. BCS is limited. It was introduced, but it's still a little bit limited and has some challenges around SQL, Azure, endpoints, and other things. So, I mean, if you just keep in mind that in general, 2010, they had a lot of the core functionality there, but then there were these exceptions. It makes a big difference when you start to look at what's coming, right? So again, 2010 version, we didn't have Project Server. We didn't, if you wanted Project, basically you had to do on-prem, right? You didn't use online. That's not true anymore, by the way. And so on and so forth. So keep in mind that that's the way it used to be. And then as of the end of February, what basically we have, February 2013, is we have SharePoint Online providing quite a few new features and capabilities. In fact, many of those new features and capabilities were designed specifically for Office 365. An example of this, guest links are only available in Office 365, right? So this is a really simple idea. Basically, I take a document or something inside of SharePoint and I say, I want to share this anonymously. I want to share this basically without someone having to sign in with someone external to the company. So you can do that. It's a guest link functionality. You can do that with SharePoint Online or SharePoint Office 365, but you can't do that with on-prem as it stands right now. So that's a interesting opportunity where it's only available in Office 365, and it was available in Office 365 first, if you will, before on-prem, if it eventually does become available. The second thing to understand here is that many of those gaps that we were just talking about have been addressed. So you can see in some of these link spots, you can see things like the Record Center template. That's now available in Office 365. Things like some of the search functionality has been improved drastically. So you have some of the fast capabilities in Office 365 because of the new search engine infrastructure. You have BCS improvements like direct to SQL Azure. I mean, again, you can have to do endpoints, but you can still do at least those connections. So BCS has been improved, and there's e-discovery opportunities across. There's site mailbox. Again, it is because since Exchange is on Exchange 2013, when you're going to Office 365, you get a lot of those new Exchange capabilities, and so on and so forth. So keep in mind there's a lot of improvements. And basically, what's still different in 2013 are these things. If you think of web analytics, those exist in the new Office 365. What's not there is things like analytics from a business intelligence perspective, performance point. To be quite honest, between Excel Services, Power View, and Power Pivot, end user business intelligence capabilities may be available to a level of sufficiency that you're like, you know what, this is okay for Office 365. But for most organizations where they really have a strong focus on business intelligence, these capabilities won't cut it, and you'll be looking at doing an on-premise business intelligence implementation. It may be that you do both, sort of a hybrid scenario, or it may be that, you know what, for that reason, and amongst other ones, you decide that an on-premise SharePoint environment still makes sense for now. For search, there are some capabilities that are in FAST, or the new search architecture in 2013, that aren't available in the cloud. So deep refinement, enhancing relevancy, sort of beyond, because you can tune it, right? You can tune relevancy and other things on-prem because you have more control. You don't have that same level of control in the cloud, and so that kind of makes sense, right? A lot of these search scenarios, when you think of very specialized tuning of relevancy or specialized scenarios, you're going to be doing that on-premise because you're going to be doing quite a bit that requires more advanced fast features or sort of pre-fast, right? So the new version of SharePoint features, and also quite a bit more sort of trust in your environment. From a development perspective, understand that full trust code will never be in Office 365. It just doesn't make sense. But there are these new app models, which is really worth discussing. I don't have a lot of time to really highlight it. Just understand this app model is a great idea in theory, and it allows you to really scale out your applications. And we've seen quite a few clients actually over the last couple of years do this internally. So they'll build these applications and they'll host them and share them in this environment, and then they'll link that to SharePoint. So that has happened for at least the large organizations we've been working with for a while. So for them, it may not be as new, but for many other organizations, it's sort of a new way of doing things. So be aware of that. The other consideration here is some of those BCS features that I had addressed in an earlier slide. If I go back a little bit, some of these aren't still available, right? So, the data search, rich client integration, I think there's subsets of that aren't available, profile pages, and so on and so forth. So just understand that, BCS isn't, if we talk about connecting to other systems, it's not a perfect, full fidelity scenario where we get the same functionality on-prem that we get online. Central administration, obviously, we don't have access to from a management perspective. Keep in mind that many services you can manage on-prem, you don't get the same level of control in a shared or multi-tenant environment, and so on and so forth. One exception here I will highlight, if you're an end user or you're someone who understands sort of the end user capabilities, one of the big ones is that you'll try and use things like the content by search web part quite a bit in the new SharePoint environment. So if you're on 2013 or if you looked at SharePoint 2013, this is an incredibly powerful web part. It's an enhancement over the content by query web part. It's a really useful web part for aggregating content across site collections, and so on and so forth. That functionality, that specific web part, doesn't exist in Office 365. So keep in mind, if you know that's one of the big things you're excited about, that's not available in Office 365 right now. And I'll talk about social when we talk about hybrid. So again, if you want to see feature availability, because this is being done right now in February, you want to go to the Microsoft resources and double check which features are available, which ones have been updated, when were the updates done, and all this other stuff, because this will change on a fairly frequent basis. Microsoft's made hundreds of small changes to Office 365 since they launched a year or two ago. So another big one, we talked about hybrid. There's the trusted hybrid, and then there's the untrusted hybrid. Let's talk a little bit about trust scenarios with hybrid, right? So what can you do with Office 365 and on-prem SharePoint environments? Where can we have some sort of integration? Well, we can federate search. Now, what that really means is it's basically just showing us SharePoint search results from our on-premise environment in our Office 365 environment, or vice versa, showing us SharePoint search results from our Office 365 environment in our SharePoint environment. Now that's really good because, as you can imagine, if we do have a hybrid scenario, we do want sort of a unified search experience. Now the downside is this is done with result set blocks. Without getting into all the details, what that basically means is it's a chunk of search results that are returned in each section, and those search results are, for all intents and purposes, isolated from the rest of the index. So the way that it does ranking, the way that it does popularity, and a bunch of other things, it's really going to treat those as one item when it starts to do that. So just keep that in mind because it is pretty important and a strong differentiator. Another big thing here is that BCS can have integration, and this is pretty useful when we're doing things like reaching across, if we want to have consistent external lists and external columns and things like that. It does still require endpoints and things like that, but WCF effort. But in general, it is a better scenario for hybrid that exists now with the updates in February versus the previous way that we used to have to do it. So keep that in mind. If you are doing BCS, it's certainly improved, and you should really relook at hybrids for BCS now. Another big one is that there isn't really any MMS or workflow or other ways to do hybrid for that. One of my biggest pet peeves on this one, and I'm just going to make sure that everyone's aware of it, is that social is a really difficult thing to have hybrid coexistence. So if you're implementing social on-prem and you have community sites and you have, specifically if you have personal sites and other social features like newsfeed, and then you have an Office 365 implementation, you will have two profile pages, you will have two news feeds, you will have two of everything, and they will not meet. There's no synchronization right now, and there's no real easy way to do it for you to synchronize those across. So if you think of, the most basic things you can imagine when you talk about social is things like following a document, right? I follow a document because I want to keep track of it, almost like a bookmark. Well, that would mean that I have two sets of followed documents, not one. So when I follow a document on-premise, it gets stored in that personal site. When I follow a document online, it gets stored in the online one. And so you really have to think about, okay, maybe we have one social profile and it's only giving online, because by the way, you can't turn that off right now in the Office 365 offering as it is. So you're probably going to use Office 365 for that. But then when you do follow a document internally, you'll have to write code, or you're going to have to do something to basically say, okay, this is going to push that information to Office 365, maybe through web service calls. Alternatively, you just disable it inside the environment, and they can only do those types of interactions in the Office 365 based content versus on-prem. But it is important to understand, like, there's an example where we have a service, something that you'd imagine you will want some hybrid support for social, and it's just not there yet. So just keep in mind that not all hybrid scenarios are going to be easy for you to execute. Another big one here is that there is Exchange integration. Some of the things like eDiscovery, Task Sync, those work, but again, there's very specific limitations and restrictions around that. A great example is that you probably need SharePoint Exchange, you probably need Exchange 2013 on-premise to take advantage of a lot of those, and so on and so forth. So just kind of work your way through hybrid, but understand there's discomfort for sure no matter which hybrid scenario it is. None of them are perfect, and certainly beyond Search and BCS, there's really not a lot from a SharePoint perspective that works from a hybrid scenario. So you really have to pick one as the primary, and most of the time the primary that you're going to choose is going to be Office 365, because your on-prem environment, you can create custom solutions to support that being your primary, full trust ones. So I'm not going to go through all this. Just kind of take a look at the documentation. It's pretty straightforward. When you do these types of hybrid scenarios, you're going to, depending on how you do it, if you're doing BCS ones and things like that, you're probably going to need a reverse proxy. You're going to need to have an appliance like UAG. If not, you need an F5 appliance. You need something that's going to be able to handle these types of considerations. You're going to need ADFS servers for identity federation. You're going to need, secure store on your SharePoint environment, which most people have, but just in case, my SOL tools, DirSync, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot of things that you need to plan for hybrid. If any of these terms don't make sense to you and you're an architect or an IT pro, then make sure you read carefully into all these things before you decide that Office 365 is the right fit for you. So licensing matters. The reason licensing is so important is because most of the cost savings you're going to get of moving to Office 365, at least from a surface level, are going to be cost savings that relate to licensing, right? We're not paying that upfront cost, and we're paying this as a subscription level event. So it is important to understand how licensing is going to work in your scenario, and I can't answer that for you because the reality is we need to kind of discuss what do you use, how many people do you have, what are the workloads, all these other factors that can be involved in figuring out the right licensing scenario for you. I will highlight that the Office 365 website does have a nice calculator and a suggestion sort of on which plan you should be on. So be sure to try those out if you haven't already. I'm going to highlight two things. One, that P plans, they're limited less than 50 users. So in general, avoid P plans. Even if you're a small company and you think you might grow over 50 users in the next year or two, the reason I would avoid that is because when you take a P plan, then you basically cannot migrate out of that. You cannot just auto upgrade out of that. You have to migrate to move out of that. So basically, let's say you hit 51 users, you still want to keep using Office 365. That means you'll have to create an E plan, and you'll have to migrate content from your P to your E, and that's an Office 365 to Office 365 migration. So it's a bit challenging and can be costly if you're not planning on it. So just keep in mind, in general, be aware of the limitations of P. There's a new structure in licensing and these offerings. They say small and mid-sized business, things like that. But really, all it really ends up being is that there's basically these enterprise plans, and there's different pricing options for those enterprise plans. So again, take a look at the Office 365 website, but just be aware that you can split your users to different types of plans. So some mid-sized user ones, some in enterprise, true enterprise, and so on and so forth. Because it's subscription-based, you really can just assign the licenses the way you want on each user, which is a new level of management, but also a new potential for cost savings. If you only know some people are using things like Excel services, only give Excel services or the enterprise level SharePoint capabilities to those people. Some other reasons to choose enterprise, and there's more beyond this, so just keep in mind enterprise has SSL, beyond the sign-in process. Both of course have it on sign-in, but just there's quite a few other things to consider here. Another big example, just to quickly give you an idea of how this works financially, is if we have 100 users, we decide E3 is the right solution, and the reason for that is because we're looking for, all of our SharePoint implementation, some of those Office applications, right? We want to be able to subscribe to licensing for the new Office because we don't want to upgrade everyone to Office 2013. We want to get on it faster, so we're going to make a much discounted, a much more cost-effective discounted subscription-based fee to Microsoft to basically license those Office licenses. And then, of course, we get Link and Exchange. If we pull that together, we can pay $20 per user per month, and we really get like the cornucopia of Office functionality, right? So if we do that, we also have SharePoint, of course, in this. It's $72,000, again, without increases in price, taxes. I'm not counting any of that. I'm just making it really basic. It's about $72,000 a year, or sorry, over 3 years. If you take an implementation right now, based on today's numbers, at a minimum, it's going to be $6,000 for 2 servers. Again, you're never going to implement SharePoint for 100 users with 1 server, so you're going to have at least 2 servers, and that's going to be a SQL server and a SharePoint server, and that's going to be a minimum of $6,000. With the absolute highest discounts that companies like ours offer for services in installing and configuring SharePoint or helping companies install with best practices and other things like that, you're looking at least $3,500, at least, right, for just the services there. And then licensing is quite expensive. It's about $79,000, and this is for 2010 pricing. So if you think about that, really, Office 365 is more expensive in year 4 than the on-prem. But if we think about the costs overall, it's certainly more economical for our business to actually make the investment in Office 365 versus on-prem. Again, if there's no technical dependencies, there's no other considerations here. Let's take that one step further and do another example. So this second example, what we're going to do is we're going to only buy SharePoint. We don't need all that other stuff. We don't need Link. We don't need Exchange. We just want to know, is SharePoint a better option? So if we were just looking at SharePoint and we start to break down the pricing, we realize very quickly that it's really quite cost effective. So in this example, we have SharePoint Online Plan 1, which is the $4 per user per month. So we're basically licensing everyone to use SharePoint Online in our 100-person company. And then the second scenario here is we do that same thing on-premise, which means we need to pay standard CALs. We need to pay SharePoint Server CALs. So in the current way that SharePoint's priced, it's going to be $30,000 versus $14,000 over 3 years. So if we're just buying SharePoint, if we just look, again, from a very high level, it makes way more sense financially to move to Office 365. So this is where the licensing discounts really come into play, right? You can make a lot more effective purchasing decisions from a financial perspective to go to Office 365. Again, this doesn't assume costs on, the implementation effort, customizing SharePoint, and what maybe the additional effort would be if you have to develop sandbox solutions or apps versus the sort of options of full trust code solutions that are on-prem. Right? There's a lot of other considerations here that could factor into cost, but in general, and of course, there's even an assumption that you're buying these servers and you don't have them sitting around. But in general, just understand that there is a big difference in licensing. And even if you're moving to 2013 and you're doing that licensing true up and you're looking at buying that new licensing, you may want to consider this because again, there is cost associated with buying those licenses in the first place, and that's quite a bit upfront versus the subscription-based cost, which decreases it over time. And by the way, just to make it clear, this is valuable for Microsoft. The reason they discount this so much is it ensures that people that move to a subscription-based model, they'll upgrade faster. So if you think about Microsoft's financial models, it actually makes more sense to get you with less money into an Office 365 or subscription-based scenario, because that means that when upgrade comes, you're not going to go, oh, we're going to put it off for another year or 2 years. And when you think about the way that they're working internally, they're developing, Office, they're developing SharePoint, they're developing these things over a couple of years, and then they're releasing it. If they don't really make the money from that release until 6 months or even a year beyond that, right, from most organizations that are kind of hesitating to do their upgrades, then that means that they're basically at a loss until they start to get all that money back, right, for all the R&D, for all the development effort leading up to it. So this subscription-based model means that they're going to get that money much faster, and it's going to basically ensure that the services that they provide, these capabilities, remain, up to date and remain very current in today's world. The last one I'm going to give an example of is that external user subscription licenses. This did change very recently. if you're using SharePoint 2013, the new licensing does not require basically external user licenses. So that's huge. It's a big difference. If you're on 2010, you do pay external user licenses. So if you're on SharePoint 2010, one reason to consider moving purely to SharePoint 2013 or SharePoint Online is because you don't need to pay a lot of those external user licenses. So just keep that in mind as well. Lastly, understand additional costs are in play. So based on storage, right, there are costs that you pay for storage. Again, this gets cheaper and cheaper versus more expensive. You can see that there was originally a price for in-market enterprise was about $250 for per gig per month for storage. It's now down to 20 cents. I'm sure that will actually go down over the next year or two to an even lower number at some point because storage just gets cheaper and cheaper, right? And the quotas that you get by default will keep increasing and so on and so forth. So just, again, keep in mind that there are additional costs. You should factor them in, but right now those costs are so minimal that they typically don't have a huge impact. The bigger ones to consider are more of limitations and constraints that at some point you really can't get bigger than 25 terabytes right now for a tenant. So if you have lots and lots of site collections in Office 365 and you have over 25 terabytes of content, it doesn't make sense to move your content on-prem into that environment. So that was really fast. It's probably the fastest I've ever talked about licensing, but we barely scratched the surface. There's a lot of trade-off and decision points. Hybrid was a big one to make sure you understand. Some of the limitations that still exist in Office 365, like business intelligence. So just keep awareness of all those issues so that if you do decide Office 365 is the right choice for you, you're going in with your eyes open and you're making the right choice for your business. You really want to be careful on kind of underestimating considerable costs around things like migration or identity federation. And it's not that ADFS and identity federation is expensive. It's the other things like cleaning up your Active Directory and doing all these other things that you really should be doing, but maybe you haven't done that. It kind of come to the forefront when you haven't done it effectively. So just keep these in mind that there are these almost hidden costs, especially like hybrid costs, but you need to make sure you're aware of what those costs are. So the next two sections, concerns in the cloud and evaluating, we're going to try and go through really fast. So I realize this whole presentation has been pretty fast, but we need to skip through those just because there's not a lot of time, and I do want to try and keep this to 60 minutes. So there are lots of concerns in the cloud. If you're on BPOS, which is hopefully very few people because this shouldn't even happen anymore, just recognize that you can migrate away from it, and there's lots of help and support for you for this. It's very, very select people. This is an old version of Office 365. Understand that the Office 365 upgrade behind the scenes that Microsoft is running in end of February and that's made optional for a lot of people is done using site collections and other things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility actually afforded to people on Office 365 in terms of how they want to upgrade and when they're going to do it. The second thing to consider here is that for the most part, it's seamless. There are issues. A great example, we were working with a client very recently. They've been upgraded to Office 365 on their tenancy. What that means is we have to use SharePoint Designer 2013 to interact with the SharePoint sites. So that means that in their environment and their on-premise in enterprise environment, they needed to spin up some additional servers just to basically manage SharePoint Designer installs because they didn't want to install it twice on 2010 and 2013 on their developer desktop. So for lots of reasons, there's lots of considerations where you move to the new version. There is some costs that may be incurred, but it's pretty infrequent and it's actually pretty seamless. The second thing to consider here is identity. I've mentioned this enough that I don't need to bring it up again. Just understand there's multiple identity options for Office 365 and you need to know the differences. There's unique development challenges. A great example is even though there is PowerShell, it's very limited, right? Most of the PowerShell that's available in the, again, post-February update is pretty limited. So you can't really do things like provision a whole site structure, right? So say you have a certain site structure internally and you want to move that to the cloud. Well, you need to recreate that site structure in the cloud. So without tools, you don't really have a lot of options afforded to you. The only workaround is site templates and again, migration tools to really build out a lot of those structures. So keep in mind that migration cost isn't just the cost of migrating the content, it's also the cost of recreating the structures and other things that you have in your on-premise environment. There are search challenges. These were the ones before the February update. So no search usage statistics. You can't perform unified search across on-premise. Again, really big challenges in the current version. But after the update, there's still some challenges. A couple examples. Remember that there's two ribbons, right? So in the Office 365 instance, we've got this ribbon up here that has people, calendar, Outlook, again, depending on whether or not you're using Exchange in Office 365. And again, the social functionalities, right? My newsfeed and other things. Whereas if we're doing on-prem, it's going to be a different ribbon bar, right? Which we have to define. So again, you probably have to customize your on-prem ribbon bar to match. Keep in mind that navigation is inconsistent. Again, navigation is constrained by site collection boundaries, right? And in Office 365, each site collection is its own sort of box, right? So we have a tenant. Your Office 365 instance can have multiple site collections, but each site collection's navigation is isolated. So to manage that on-prem, there's lots of ways, right? We can write scripts, we can do all sorts of things to basically keep consistency with things like global navigation. But in Office 365, it's manual. There's really very few ways of automating that management of navigation. So keep that in mind as a pain point. Again, I've talked enough about social and the gaps there. This is what I was talking about from the search. So this is the hybrid search scenario. It's great. The problem is that this result set is counted as one item. So if you're doing different things like sorting and filtering, refining, if you will, it has a big impact because it'll hide a whole section of it versus other ones. There's cost modeling. I showed you some numbers. Don't trust those numbers on face value. Make sure you do your own cost modeling. Security isn't really an issue. So if you think it's an issue on moving to Office 365, I'll tell you right now, I don't believe that you're right on that. If you're moving to any large, respectable hosting provider, typically they have better accountability and better security planning activity than you're going to have on-prem, unless you're a very, very specific and specialized organization. So security is typically not an issue. Microsoft alone has over 800 preventative, detective, and corrective controls, right? So it's like almost saying instead of your unlocked door to the server room, they've got 6 guys with Uzis or something standing guard. They don't actually, but just to give some context. Privacy, all that information is available from Microsoft. Make sure you read through those policies if you can and if you understand them. If you don't, make sure you get somebody else who does understand those to read through them to make sure you know what will happen with your information and who can see it, who can't. There's an issue of reliability a lot of people bring up. Is SharePoint in a hosted scenario more reliable than on-prem? The gist is this, right? A lot of people say, I want, what's safer, a plane or a car? Right? Well, it's not often about safety. It's also like which one's faster, right? Which one's more expedient? Well, if we think about it, planes can have delays, they can have cancellations, they can be affected by weather, perhaps a little bit more even than by cars. Cars have a little bit more flexibility and control. So if you think about our on-premise environments, we get a lot of control. They're kind of like the car, but we don't get the scale. We don't get the capabilities that the plane has where we can actually be really efficient, where we have this little seat in the plane. We don't have as much control, but we get to our location faster and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of considerations there. The gist is this. It's really not a fair argument, reliability, because the reality is what we really want is a plane car. I want a plane car where I have the same level of control of my car, but if I want to fly and get somewhere quicker, I can just fly away. The reality is this is impossible for me financially on my own now, but it is possible for enterprise organizations to have a plane car, if you will, for hosted and on-prem. You can have hybrid scenarios where you're getting the discounted cost and scale and other things from these cloud scenarios, but you're still having the same control and other capabilities you have for that car level thing, which is your on-premise implementations. So just keep in mind that it's still possible. Keep in mind that you need to understand the offline story. This is very easy for SharePoint. There's tons of different offline capabilities. Understand your service level agreements. Example, in Google support, I'm not sure if this is still true, but it used to be that for Google Apps, you have to have over 50% of your users being affected before you can call phone support, which is crazy. Microsoft doesn't have that. So also keep in mind if you're, say, a legal team and you've got a matter coming up, big court case or something, you can't tell Microsoft, don't do your update on this time, right? You have less control. So you basically have to work around their schedule. Again, it's very infrequent. It should be very little downtime, but just understand that you can't necessarily have that same level of control when someone else controls that service. Understand what happens on termination, understand migration costs, and I've talked about a lot of this already to you guys. Integration, really the big thing on integration is actually this next slide, LAN versus WAN, because if we do integration, there's typically bandwidth and other collateral challenges, because when we're doing it on-prem, we have very quick access to other information and we have to do less, structured endpoints and other things. When we're doing it in the Office 365 environment, we need to do more of that. And of course, that has an impact on differences between networks and bandwidth. All right, that was really fast. Just understand that, there are lots of concerns with Office 365 in the cloud. To be quite honest, most of them just require additional planning. Once you've done the planning, there's really not any issues beyond that. The big thing here to understand is that there are concerns that are different for every provider. I've been really harping on Office 365. That doesn't necessarily mean those concerns are the same for, the host of providers that are out there. So really compare and understand that each host provider needs to be evaluated in an isolated sense. Like, you can compare it, but you really want to make sure you understand what are their privacy considerations, security, and so on and so forth. So on to evaluating different cloud providers. So the trick here is basically to ask questions. And so what I've done is I've added a bunch of questions for you to ask. There's also a link in the slide deck that's available on SlideShare. But basically, go through, make sure you ask these questions. I'll go through a little bit slowly just so you can pause it to read through the questions. But make sure you ask them. There's questions around storage. Where will my data be stored? And how do we get access to it? And, where is the actual, Microsoft will tell you which data center it's in, but that's all they can tell you. They can't tell you like where it is within that data center. Identity and access, right? How's that going to work? As I said, identity is a really important one to consider here. Reliability and support. There's quite a few things we need to ask around support and how that really works. Keep in mind that with Office 365, the forums are a really powerful component of support. There's a lot of activity on the forums and a lot of Q&A. Performance, there's tons of considerations here. There's some tools that I'll highlight that you can use. Flexibility, really big. More flexibility. And more flexibility. Flexibility, I think, is the most important thing to consider. So there's quite a few references to flexibility in here for questions. Understand the costs. Can you leverage your existing agreements to get a discount? Most likely. So make sure you understand those options. Look at tools. These are a couple. The Service Management Index is pretty useful. It gives you an idea of first what to measure and look at, and two, how things are actually measured, like from a statement perspective. And you can look at multiple providers. You can use Cloud Sleuth. It'll tell you a lot about latency and response time and other things like that, which is pretty powerful. And you can sort of again, look at it on your own. There's a ton of benchmarks from Cloud Harmony and other great tools. I like Cloud Harmony a lot, so if you're looking for really interesting benchmarks, you can do that with a lot of different cloud services and servers. And if you're looking for more questions, there's things like the Cloud Security Alliance, which actually has, with the Consensus Assessments Initiative, created a massive number of questions, many of which I didn't even bring up. Again, many of those are also around security and standardization of security, so make sure you ask a lot of those questions. The key is, you have lots of information available and tools. Use them, leverage them, and make sure that you're getting the most information so that your decision, is made in full awareness of the facts. And of course, trust but verify. Even if that salesperson says yes, there is no security concerns. Even if you've heard me talking about those things, recognize that you need to do your own due diligence and verify whether or not you have specific circumstances that are unique for your organization. That aren't going to be obviously matched by the blanket statements and blanket policies and other things that are in place. So thank you everyone so much for your time. With that, please feel free to look up the slides on slideshare.com, and for some reason I don't have that on here, so slideshare.net/rharbridge. If you go to my website, my blog, and then you go to my website, inside my website, if you go to the speaker section, you'll also find this somewhere in there in the list around February of 2013 that I've done this webinar, and so you'll be able to go and look at that and download the slide deck as well if you want to use some of these slides, or again if you're looking for some notes or something that I might have hidden in the slides. So thank you everyone for your time, and hope this was useful to you.